The following program does not necessarily represent the views and opinions of Reality Radio 101, its advertisers and sponsors, or its listening audience. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome to the Bear Psychology Radio Show with psychologist, author, and speaker, Dr. Anna Baranowski, where mind, mood, and what matters to you are discussed. We're broadcasting live from Toronto, Ontario, Canada, on Reality Radio 101. Our email address is instudio101@gmail.com. And now, your host of the Bear Psychology Radio Show, Dr. Anna Baranowski. And Dr. Anna,
hi everyone.
There you go.
I'm so glad to be back with you here again today. I hope everything is great out there in the world listening to our show today and talking about the Bear Psychology Radio Show with our guest today, Bill Wahl, who is a counseling psychologist who has been working with the National Health Service, and he's joining us from the UK. So I'm thrilled to have you from across the pond, as they say. And I have in front of me two of the heaviest books that I've ever had sent to me from an author. The Historical Trauma Program for Self-Help or to Support Individual Therapy, a guidebook of hope and recovery for people who have experienced childhood abuse, neglect, or abandonment. And he also has a similar book that is focused on group therapy. Now, Bill Wahl tells me he has just recently retired and then almost immediately gone right back to work. So we're going to hear a little bit about his own journey of doing that. And I want to just, for all our listeners here today, remind you that we would love to hear from you. As you know, I love getting those emails throughout our show at instudio101@gmail.com. It definitely makes for an interesting conversation. So as we talk today to Bill about his work with NHS and the models that he has built to help both individuals and groups looking at historical trauma. So thank you so much, Bill, for joining us and sharing your knowledge.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I'm very grateful to be here and to have an opportunity to talk about something that's very close to my heart.
So that's probably the starting point for me. What makes this work, historical trauma, close to your heart? Maybe you can start by defining it for us, your vision of historical trauma. And what even ever got you interested in this work, because it's so very precise.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I mean, what got me interested in the work of psychology and practicing psychology, I guess that goes way back. And I guess, like a lot of us that go into this field, it's just a fascination with human psychology, emotion, relationships. And I think from the very beginning, there was just something quite extraordinary about sitting in a room and someone who is often in a very difficult state comes and sits down with you. And because of your role and just the everything that surrounds the clinical space within minutes. They're talking to you about things which are incredibly sensitive and important. It's very humbling, actually, to kind of find yourself in that situation. And despite the fact that I've done it for 35 years, there's just not a day uh, where it's dull. There's always something new. Everything's a kind of new detective story that you're involved in as you're trying to figure out how to help, an individual. Um, and I suppose I really started specializing in childhood trauma a good 20, 25 years ago, or something like that, for reasons I probably can't even quite put my finger on, but I think that's just ended up being the trajectory for me, really.
Yeah, sometimes the knock comes and, we find ourselves going down a certain path. And it is very, compelling work. I like the fact that you kind of call it detective work because I've often used that phrase myself, when you show up. And I do understand this idea of how humbling it is, when you're working so deeply with somebody and they must perceive that this is a safe place to start to express the things that they may have held on to for a lifetime, and they show up with what I know to be enormous courage and a willingness to have those conversations. It's not easy and it can be incredibly painful. But here you are working in this work for 35 years and then specializing for 25 years with childhood trauma. And from looking at the two books that you've published, the guidebooks, they both are extremely detailed. um, but it seems like you're working with the adults who have experienced childhood trauma. And I mean, why don't we talk a little bit about, what it has been like to write those programs and
Yeah.
why you were motivated to write those programs.
Yeah, sure. So there's a bit of a backstory. So I mean, I can talk in a bit more detail about the historical trauma program, uh, what it is, how it works, how clinicians can use these guidebooks as a basis for either individual therapy or group therapy. I can talk about our experiences. I can answer any questions that listeners might have. But there's a bit of a backstory to how the historical trauma program really developed. And I think it's worth spending a bit of time with, in part because I want to give credit to some other authors and to some of my colleagues. I think that were it not for another workbook called the Breaking Free Workbook, written many years ago by Toon and Ainscough, I'm not sure the historical trauma program would exist, actually. So what happened is, working in this NHS psychology and psychological therapy service for many, many years, about maybe 15 or 18 years ago, a colleague of mine, a clinical psychologist, very talented woman named uh, Dr. Liz Murphy, stumbles onto a workbook called the Breaking Free Workbook. Now, it's a workbook designed for survivors of childhood sexual abuse, and she passes it around the department. Lots of us are reading it, lots of us like it. Lots of us start using that workbook as a basis for doing individual therapy with survivors of childhood sexual abuse. And it works really well and it's pretty safe. And then at one point, Liz decides she's going to create a group therapy model using that Breaking Free workbook as a kind of basis to guide people through the group therapy. Now, she did that with female colleagues for female survivors of childhood sexual abuse. And so I'm sort of standing on the sidelines, watching this work that they're doing in this group and the way that it's developing. And they're getting good attendance rates, completion rates. It's relatively safe. People are having good experiences. And one day I'm talking with Liz, and I said, "This is so helpful. The only problem or limitation is you're using it specifically for women. And a lot of people that come through our service have got all manner of traumas, so physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, abandonment, neglect. Do we need something that's like this work that you're doing with Breaking Free, but that's broader? We can capture these other people. That's maybe workbook based. So we looked around, we saw maybe 4 or 5 different workbooks, but we didn't like any of them. So at that point, I thought, okay, I'll have a crack at writing a workbook for male and female survivors of all manner of childhood trauma that we can use as a basis for group therapy. And it's a bit ridiculous, but the first workbook had about 14 chapters. And I think Liz and I started group therapy when I'd written about the first 10. That's how rough it was. So I had to actually write quickly to finish the thing before the group actually finished. But people showed up, everyone completed it, and it seemed kind of safe and it worked. And so for the past 10 years, we've been just developing the historical trauma program for group therapy guidebook, and it's kind of been written and rewritten over time. And so that's kind of how it all developed.
So Bill, when you do these groups, are they in person? Are they online? Like how do people attend?
Well, I mean, during COVID, everything was online, wasn't it? But aside from that, it's all been face to face. So we have groups running kind of within the county that I live in Devon, and it's the group the reason that there's 2 different guidebooks is 85% of the content is exactly the same, but one of them is just designed to be used with people that are doing individual therapy, and or they could use it as self-help, and the other one is just used for people in a group in group therapy. The group therapy program, we kind of developed off the back of what my colleague Liz did with the Breaking Free program, because she'd had 5 years to kind of fine tune things. So the reason it's a program is there's kind of different bits to it. The most important thing is safety, that people are not going to get destabilized, become suicidal, increase in poor coping and all that. So the really careful assessment work, make sure we get the right people in. And then we do about 4 to 6 one-to-one pre-group sessions where they begin working with the book, and the initial bits of the book are really around stabilization and safety. And then we have about 8 of these individuals, men and women, adults, who start the group work, and they do 22 weekly group therapy sessions, 2.5 hour long sessions, which I know is a very long session.
That is very, very long. And it's interesting that you have such a large number of people who will complete the whole group. Why is that, do you think?
Well, I think the reason we do have we get about we've sort of tracked this over the years, and we do have about 85% attendance rate and about 88% completion rate. I think what we've learned to do is to be really careful about the intake and assessment process. So we don't put people into a group-based program where they're using this guidebook if they're significantly self-harming, drug and alcohol issues, lots of instability in life. If they have severe PTSD kinds of issues, that's a no-no as well. Mm-hmm. Also, when I say about 88% completion, those are the people that start the group. Now, there is some attrition at the front end. So we've learned that 4 to 6 individual therapy sessions before the group starts is really important, because we get a good handle on who's going to be able to make that transition into the group and have a productive, safe experience. And we'll lose some people. So we might start with 10, and then by the time the group starts, we're down to 7. But hopefully, because of our assessment and that pre-group individual work, we've got a solid 7 who then will stay the course. And to be honest, we as therapists, we really work our socks off to keep people in the group once they start. We like everyone to finish. The other component of the group program is while individuals are doing their group therapy, they're also having a once weekly individual therapy session.
Got it.
We use counseling psychology students, DCLIN students, other students, and that one-to-one session is really important in terms of helping people process what happens in the group, process the reading they're doing with the guidebook, and just keeping them from bolting, from the whole thing. So I think the good completion rate is because of the work that goes into assessment, individual pre-group stuff, and then those one-to-one sessions. And I need to credit my colleague Liz Murphy in the work that she did with the Breaking Free program because she figured out that whole structure and I just borrowed it.
Nice. Can you just go in for a moment and speak to the issue of historical trauma? This is actually from Frank, who just emailed us and said, historical trauma, what is that? So maybe we can have a little bit of a definition so people know what we're really, really talking about here.
Yeah, sure. So we say historical trauma. Largely, this is guidebooks um, and program that underlie programs of therapy, individual or group, for people who experienced childhood trauma. So we're talking about physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, neglect, abandonment, vicarious trauma. Um, we kind of liked the word historical trauma for the program in the guidebook, and I'll tell you why. There's a huge amount of evidence that people that experienced um, childhood trauma are much more vulnerable and likely to experience further trauma in adulthood, also referred to as re-traumatization. So historical will be, what happened in childhood, but very likely it's what continued happening to people in their 20s, 30s, 40s.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and that just comes to the next question that I've got in front of me from Glenn. Thank you for your email, Glenn. So the book is about adults that have had childhood trauma, or is it about trauma in one's adult life? So, you really capture that well. And I see that clinically myself that, when there is childhood trauma, we often see these points in life where people are then exposed again to adult trauma. And really, the resolution for adult trauma when there's childhood trauma is to do some deeper processing work that just addressing the current events doesn't seem to, get to the source code of somebody's life struggles. When there's that
Mhm.
historical trauma, some call it different names, but in your case, the way you're framing it is historical trauma. So great. And it seems like you're trying to really get at, like in the beginning of the book, you say there are two groups who deeply know about childhood trauma. One, those who directly experience it, and two, those who care or provide care for the individuals who have experienced childhood trauma. But from my experience, because I do so much training and teaching clinicians, is that in fact there's an overlap at times between the individuals who have experienced it directly and the clinicians who provide care for those individuals. So can you talk to that? I have no doubt that in your programs, sometimes you're dealing with that overlap group.
Sorry, what is the overlap
Let me
group?
just say it again. You start by saying there's two groups who deeply know about trauma.
Yes,
Those who have directly experienced it, and those that provide care for the individuals who have experienced trauma. But
yes,
from my experience doing training, teaching, talking to people for many years, working with clients, many of whom are actually in both of these categories. Not only do they
yes.
provide care, but they have also deeply experienced it directly as well. How
Yes.
do you address the needs of those individuals? And, do you take the time to recognize that these are people who get this deep knowledge from both places?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's not an accident that many of us will go into practicing psychology, psychotherapy, counseling, or, related fields, psychiatric nursing, social work, etc. So many of us clinicians will have experienced childhood trauma, uh, childhood harm, certainly. And so we're working from our development of theory and our training and so forth, but our own personal experience, aren't we? Aren't we? And I think, in a number of respects, the historical trauma program, whether it's used for individual therapy, whether it's underlying group therapy, is not unique in that it doesn't reinvent the wheel. We borrow from lots of, wonderful stuff going on within trauma studies. There's a lot in there around traumatic core beliefs, re-traumatization, trauma bonding. There's a lot schema therapy you'll find kind of cropping up now and again, attachment theory. So a lot of it is familiar, but there's a couple of things that I think are unique. One of those things is the historical trauma program as a guidebook, as a way of doing therapy, developed over 10 years. And like I said, the very first guidebook was really rough. And then what happened is about 450 clients went through this model of therapy, about 300 of them doing the group model, about 150 doing one-to-one therapy. And what is a bit unique, I think, about it is the extent of collaboration that happened between clinicians and clients. And so hopefully they were having experiences which were therapeutic, but laden with insight and learning. But as clinicians, we were constantly learning from them. So they're working with the earlier editions of the guidebooks and continually just telling us like what they are identifying with, what doesn't really touch them, when maybe the guidebook was pushing them too hard and we needed to be a bit more careful. Or sometimes they would say, come on, you push us a little bit more, ask us to think about this or work with that. Um, and so there was this kind of back and forth where we were learning a lot from them about what works and what what doesn't work, and language which is too complex and doesn't touch them in, some way or another.
Mhm, mhm. It sounds like there was a really nice communication loop and a way of integrating what you were learning constantly from the clients to make sure that they could meaningfully engage in these activities, because it does sound like a very demanding program. Having read through it, it seems that you have tried to give people an enriched experience of self-exploration while also protecting them from going so deeply or so quickly that they wouldn't be able to tolerate the demands. And that sounds like it's not a very easy thing to actually be successful at, because doing deep work while also protecting your clients can be a stretch. What do you think of that?
Oh, I think you've kind of got right to the heart of what's been the most challenging thing about developing this program of therapy. I mean, in part, it was developed because the vast majority of clients coming into this secondary care service experience childhood trauma. So we're having to find ways of helping them. And when you work for the NHS, there's never enough resources. So we can't give
Right.
people 5 years of individual therapy. The whole service would be dead within a month or two, right? So we had to try to find a way to create therapeutic models which were safe enough, um, got them working in ways which were going to be meaningful, important, um, but were also reasonably time limited.
Mhm.
So the historical trauma program grew up in that context, and it's a little bit of a compromise in that way. You know, the whole program, if you're doing it individually or the group model, is about 6 months, which is pretty fast, you
That's
know,
fast. Um,
for this client
I
group.
wonder if you'd talk a little bit about the window of tolerance because it fits quite well with what we're talking about right now, Daniel
Mhm.
Siegel's work. Focused and coping or hyperarousal, hypoarousal. If you could kind of uh, walk us through that, help our listeners understand that.
Yeah, I mean, Siegel's model is lovely, isn't it? Because it's very straightforward visually. It's easy for people to understand. The window of tolerance as a model is kind of, you know, right there, probably on page 20 or something like that
Yeah, it's
in,
on page
in the
20. I've
book.
got it in front of
It's or
me.
somewhere around there. Uh, it's such a nice guide, and it's the sort of thing that sometimes, even though you've worked with it, it actually comes up in the pre-group work, that sort of individual work that you do before people go into the group session. But then you have to kind of wheel it out again and say, "Oh, let's think about this. What shall we?" Um,
So
but I think,
I love the way you wrote it here. The window of tolerance developed by Daniel Siegel is a further way to appreciate if you're losing stability. Now, I just think that's great because it's just so straightforward. We all know what that feels like. You
yeah,
say humans can flip into states of fight, flight, or freeze when we encounter or imagine we counter a threat. Fighting or fleeing is consistent with the state of hyperarousal, a reaction characterized by emotions such as a fear or anger. And alternatively, we can also cope with threats through freezing, a state of hypoarousal characterized by emotional numbing, shutting down, or becoming immobilized. Essentially, the window of tolerance. One or the other. You're either doing perfectly fine, or you're in hypo or hyper arousal, fight or
yeah,
flight or freeze. So,
yeah,
I just think people could kind of imagine that pretty easily. It's one of those,
yeah,
yep,
yeah,
makes sense.
yeah.
Can you talk about where people can get your book?
Oh, it's available on Amazon. So Amazon, you know, .ca for you folks, and Amazon.com, Amazon.co.uk. So you
So we
find,
we have people all over the world listening to us, and an awful lot of people in the U.S. Thank you to our U.S. friends and people in the U.K. as well, because we have actually interviewed several U.K. authors as well. So I'm going to read it again: The Historical Trauma Program for Self-Help or to Support Individual Therapy, a guidebook of hope and recovery for people who've experienced childhood abuse, neglect, or abandonment. Bill Wahl, and you will see that as a link if you did get an invitation to watch this show. We always put that on our website as well, the details of how to get the books that we for the interviews that we have. So thank you for that question, Monica. And I'm going to read some more of our emails from our wonderful listeners. And remember, if you do want to email us, you can do that at instudio101@gmail.com. And we love to have you part of this conversation. So this was from Tim, and I think you've actually really covered this well, Bill. The question is this book just for sexual abuse? And you've made it clear that you're really, I mean, and when I read the book, when I went through it, it just seemed like it covered such broad topics in such an open way that it gave you a sense that you could really use this book, whoever
Mhm.
you are, particularly this one, the one for self-help. Can you tell us a little bit about your desire to write it as a self-help?
Yeah, I mean, as I was saying, the first book that I wrote was the historical trauma program for group therapy because I wanted to use it alongside with my colleagues in a group therapy format. But what we realized kind of very quickly is that there were some people who group therapy just wasn't right for. Maybe they were struggling with social anxiety to such an extent that they just can't sit in a group. Some people do get very, very triggered by anybody else that's talking about their own traumatic experiences. And so we thought, well, let's take that same guidebook, but reshape it a bit just so it's formatted for people to use as self-help, or they might be using it while they're doing individual therapy. So in other words, there may be 25 sessions of individual therapy, but they're working with the guidebook while they're working with an individual therapist. Now, the one caveat here is um, thinking about the guidebook for self-help or to support individual therapy. Um, if you're going to use this guidebook for self-help, you really need to have good levels of stability, safety. You probably need to have some social support. You probably need to be able to think and remember about what happened without getting very distressed. Um, if you're really unable to do that, or you're struggling with self-harm or drugs and alcohol, you might need to get some stability first. Or if you want to use that guidebook, you would want to do that with individual therapy, I would think. And the other thing I'll mention, which is related to this, is we also realized that there are a surprising number of people who struggle to use a book. Now, some of them might struggle with reading because they might struggle with dyslexia, or maybe dyslexia was undiagnosed in childhood. Others will really struggle with a book format because their unresolved trauma means they really have a difficult time paying attention. So probably way back towards the beginning of all of this, we created an audio version. And I would say, when you say to clients during the assessment period, would you find an audio version of the book helpful? About 1 in 3 people say, yes, please.
Oh, wow. Okay,
Yeah. So there's a
that's really,
free,
yeah.
yeah. I mean, I think this is in your notes that go along with the blog that came out, but there is a free version of the audio version of both of these books available on YouTube. Now,
Right.
yeah,
Yes, I do remember that. That's so helpful, actually. And I absolutely agree that it's not for everybody, just reading and trying to make sense of things. So I see that we have some resources here. And purchase the book, learn more. Is that on the Bill Wall? Oh, no, it isn't. HTP community.org. Is that where
that's
it
it.
is?
So that's the HTP website. And if you go to the HTP website, you'll quite easily find a link to the YouTube site where the audio versions of both of these guidebooks are available to anyone. Now, what I would add, though, is that if you're going to use the audio version, you will need to have the print version as well, because it's a workbook format, isn't it? So
Right.
there's lots of checklists that you're working with, opportunities for writing, um, you know, and but it works well. You can listen to the audio, pause the audio, do some work with the guidebook, restart the audio, and you're kind of going back and forth. We've had some very nice feedback from people over the years that says, I get that. That can work.
That's beautiful. That's really great, and such a great resource for people to be able to use at no extra cost. I mean, I guess they could purchase the book so they can use the fill-ins, but it's really a nice thing to offer. Okay, I'm going to go back to our questions because they are piling up, and I love talking to the listeners. So this is from Mike. Hi, Mike. Thank you for your message. This is this workbook. Is this book workbook for self-diagnosis? Well, let's get into that for a moment. Go ahead, Bill.
Thanks for the question, Mike. Um, there is a chapter towards the beginning, and I'll have to remind myself. I think it's called "Are There Words to Describe?" Are there words that can describe historical trauma? And so in that particular chapter, there's generic descriptions of different kinds of childhood harm. And then there's also hopefully a helpful description of complex post-traumatic stress disorder.
Mhm.
So if people are wondering, are the kinds of experiences and problems I have consistent with complex post-traumatic stress disorder, reading that chapter might help you, I
And
would say.
then, of course, if you do think that you may meet the symptoms criterion, then please talk to a professional
Yeah.
because, it is true that sometimes we can interpret things based on feelings that are acute that you're having in the moment. But please, please, if you do read these books, do take the time not to personally diagnose yourself or somebody else, but take the time to actually speak to a professional. Maybe you need extra care. Like I just wouldn't want you to be out there in the world, telling everybody you have PTSD or complex PTSD before you've actually gotten a formal diagnosis, because eventually a formal diagnosis would be needed, especially if, let's say, you need to go on long-term disability, or there's been an injury. You really, really want to get that extra support and care and professional guidance.
I
Um,
think can I just say I think that's a really good point,
yeah.
Anna. And I think the sort of spirit of the historical trauma program is we don't get too caught up or carried away with diagnosis.
Yeah.
If people have a sense of I got harmed in childhood in ways which are fairly significant and it's affecting me today in a way which is problematic,
I
then
love that you say that because I agree with that absolutely. I'm just finishing a book. It'll probably come out early in the new year. And although we add all these checklists as well, in the end, I'm quite aware that when people have been exposed to events in their lifetime that they haven't been able to get over, even if they don't meet the criterion for PTSD, they still may benefit quite a bit from getting that extra care or the specialized care to deal with the impact of trauma or very difficult life events. And in fact, I do find that, a lot of people have experienced pretty extreme trauma, have great resources, and they get on with life, and they can do what they need to do to manage the demands. And sometimes I'm so impressed with the resiliency that some people show, whether they actually meet the criterion or not. So yeah, keeping that in mind. Now, this is from Francis, so maybe you can help me make sense of this one, Bill. I'm not sure I understand it 100%. Francis says, is this the, in quotations, the art of impossibility, telling us that all is impossible in life? What do you make of that?
it's someone who probably noticed that I wrote a novel called The Art of Impossibility.
Okay, all right. Tell us
So,
about your
so
novel.
Francis, I don't want to get too carried away with it. I wrote a novel some time ago called The Art of Impossibility, and it's out there as well if people are interested in it. So that's probably Francis kind of connecting that
That's
particular
really
book.
funny.
That's probably how you make sense out of that, Anna.
Okay, well, thank you. So I didn't quite connect the dots on that. Just for a moment, could you tell us a little bit about the art of impossibility? It's a very intriguing title.
Oh, uh, I would, I don't, my worry, Anna, is I would end up taking too much time.
Just
It's a
give
book
me.
I love. It's a book I loved writing, and hopefully other people enjoy it. And you said a moment ago, you said, "Isn't that so lovely?" or something that I put out the audio version of the historical trauma program for free. I'll let you in on a personal secret. What I've kind of discovered as an author, because I have two novels and a collection of short stories out as well, um, is unless you're Stephen King or J.K. Rowling, almost nobody makes money, probably except Amazon, from books.
Yes,
And
yes,
so,
that's
so
true. That's
I've
true.
kind of, I mean, I've kind of I'm just putting the historical trauma program out there. I've actually kept the price of it very low because I have no kind of expectations that I'm going to be a kind of wealthy, famous person off of publishing of books, and that's kind of experience. So, and I'm kind of at a nice stage in life. I'm 61 years old. I've been able to go from working full time and managing a psychology department to working a couple of days a week as a humble garden variety counseling psychologist. So I have time, and I'm just enjoying putting the book out there, uh, doing some training. I mean, one thing I'll mention to your listeners is if you work for or manage a mental health organization and you're interested in the historical trauma program and you feel that your organization would benefit from some training with respect to this particular model of therapy, you can get in touch with me. There's an email address that you'll find in the book, and I'd be happy to have a conversation with you. So I think at this stage of my life, I want to have fun and I want to help people, and I've got some free time to do that with respect to the historical trauma program, and that's my focus really.
Beautiful. So I will just say this because I do like the title, The Art of Impossibility. I don't know if people are familiar with Goodreads, but whenever I want to buy a book or I want to recommend a book, I encourage people to go to Goodreads. And this book was published in 2012, and it is a fascinating exploration of identity, alienation, and relationship, deft, touching, and ironic. So I think that's interesting because, obviously, this is just my interpretation. You just correct me if I'm wrong, Bill, but I often find that we're inspired. It's hard to separate completely the things that we are exposed to as clinicians and the depth of the work that we do from the things that we subsequently use as a window into the world, especially if it's creativity like this one. Obviously, you're getting some creativity pouring through you, and I just wonder if your clinical work has somehow inspired you in your writing.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. You sit down and you listen to clients day in and day out, and essentially they're telling you stories. And a lot of these stories are downright fascinating. And that's why this job is just so humbling in one respect. Uh, One of the things I really enjoyed about the development of the historical trauma program, I mean the guidebooks, is the very first edition 10 years ago had very few client quotes. And as I'm doing therapy in groups year after year, um, it's common for clients to just come out with some insight, some story, which is just fascinating and sometimes just really impressive. They figured something out like that. They put something in such a poetic way.
Yeah, some of the
Mm.
quotes are really lovely and striking.
Yeah,
Like, this client who says, "I don't really like being touched. If my husband or other people try to hug me, my skin sort of crawls. I can enjoy sex, but just the sex part. I don't like it when it becomes intimate or emotional. And so it reveals so much kind of understanding of what is happening for this individual rather than just being reactive. This individual has taken the time to understand themselves, so
yeah,
it like
yeah.
peppered throughout the book. We have a lot of these moments that have been captured, which is incredible. Okay, this is about your other book. um, Bob is asking if you wrote The Edge of the World, and if you did, can you explain it? And I'm going to just read what it says here. The Edge of the World, this is you, right? You wrote The Edge of the World, right?
Yes, guilty as charged.
Okay, that's what I thought. The book, Drunk and Disheveled, Max is helped off a bridge by police officers in an apparent suicide attempt. So here we go, straight to trauma. So, this is what we were saying before. Is there some kind of, influence?
Yeah.
And so, you're writing about it, a man struggling for reasons to live in a helpless UK
Mm.
government that is
Yeah.
always three steps behind.
Yeah.
So, yeah,
Well,
we.
I think that's true. I have one hat, which is psychologist. The other hat is fiction writer. And they overlap an awful lot because, um, in one respect, our work is clinical and we pay a lot of attention or try to pay attention to kind of research and guidance about what works and all of that. And that's very important. But a lot of our work is just downright existential. How do people live? How do they make sense out of the world? How do they extract meaning? How do they go about relationships? And of course, all of that is not just about mental health. It's the stuff of fiction as well, isn't it?
Mhm.
Yeah. And
It's interesting because I was just having a conversation with my supervision group this morning, and I was thinking about how we need to lean in more to the places where there is flow, like an outlet for our fulsome creativity. And I don't know if you're familiar with Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, who wrote Flow, The
well, sure.
Psychology of Optimal Experience. And, just my feeling about, even when we're doing great clinical work, the real growth happens when we take on that element of our life where we are fully immersed in the true um, kind of outlet being in our life, where we're not distracted, we're just fully in it. And
Yeah.
it's kind
Yeah.
of a marker to me that we have kind of crossed over into a place where we are doing much much better. And I'm always, looking for those moments with clients, or encouraging clients to really think through that lens of flow. What is that going to take for you to find that? And for some people it's difficult to find that, right?
Hmm.
Here is another one, so that we can, you know, um, get into a little bit more um, of this these emails, and there really are quite a few of them. So I want to make sure that we can look here. Oh yeah, let's just check. This is a very straightforward question. This is from Howard. Thank you so much, Howard. Howard says, longtime listener here, so I'm really appreciative of that, Howard, and to everybody out there who's been listening. We do these radio shows once a month, so people log in, and that means a lot because we prepare for it and we want you to join us and engage in the conversation. Is the book available online in digital form as well?
Thank you, Howard. Unfortunately, it's not. But that was a decision that I made just because of the nature of the book. So it's a workbook. So there's lots of opportunities for there's checklists, surveys, writing that you're doing, and it just didn't really kind of suit something like a Kindle experience, I don't think. And I did try as much as I could to put out a paperback book, which was going to be really comfortable. So it's a big format. The print is a really nice size to read. There's plenty of space. Um, and but I just didn't think it would work as something like an ebook, given that the participation that the clients are having with it.
This one's from Ron, who asks, thank you, Ron. Love this show today. Very interesting. Yeah, it is. It's very compelling, this work. Is this information in the book being used in the practice of sessions and counseling in the US? Have you had other conversations, Bill? Not yet?
You're the first.
Oh, wow.
This is me.
Okay.
This is the historical trauma program, cracking into North America somehow.
Yeah.
So the book,
Yeah.
it's really I have only been practicing. My colleagues, we've only been practicing here in the UK with the HTP. This book has been rewritten and rewritten for 10 years, but basically we've just been kind of burning up and destroying NHS photocopiers as we print this stuff out and hand it to clients. So the book has only come out in print form very recently. So no, you will not find people using the historical trauma program in America because it's been a very UK centric project. But I would be very pleased if there are clinicians listening today, uh, that would be interested in acquiring the book, having a look, seeing how it goes if you use it alongside individual therapy that you're doing, or if you feel ambitious enough to try to start a group-based HTP program. And as I mentioned earlier, if you work for an organization and you want to get in touch with me and have a think with me about doing some training with you to kind of get you going with all of that, I'd be very happy to hear from people.
I want to cover a couple of things within the book before we finish today. This to me is one of the most important things. When we talk about historical trauma, it is fairly common for individuals, especially if the trauma happened when they were quite young, for that to be pre-verbal
Yeah,
or for there to be great difficulties in bringing the experience out. And
yeah,
you did a good job of capturing some of this when children struggle to explain or understand what happened to them. And I think this is where the book really has a lot of strength, is that you are normalizing experiences that are very common in historical trauma, and you identify them as not thinking about it in order to cope. Those
yeah,
around telling the child to let it go or minimize. Three is too long. It was too long ago to recall clearly. Four is it just seemed normal. This is how life was, so it's just
yeah,
normal, for these things to happen.
yeah,
Five is not wanting to accept that this actually happened. Six is needing to protect the abuser. Seven is some are still frightened by the abuser, and eight is some blame themselves for what happened. With all of that being true,
yeah.
and recognizing that, anybody who's coming to want to make sense of or work through their trauma, how do you help somebody who's struggling with these eight things come to a place that they can actually do this work?
Oh, that's such a big question. It's such a good question. I would say slowly, carefully, gradually. These are big ideas, aren't they? And
Mm.
there's one of the chapters is called The Child's Perspective. And we point out that if you experience childhood trauma, there are two very different ways to look at this. There's you as an adult now, looking back on it, making sense out of it, and there's the way that you as a child were making sense out of it. And so part of your work is to kind of understand that these are different and to make sense out of why these are different. And one of the things that is not completely unique, but a bit unique about the historical trauma program is it's a stage 1, 2, and 3 model of therapy. So very briefly, stage 1 is, stabilization and stability, isn't it? Stage 2, this is Judith Herman thinking, right?
Yeah,
So
Judith Herman.
stage
Yeah.
stage 2 would be what you might call it processing, but that's a fancy way of saying being able to think about it, remember about it, make sense about it, talk about it, write about it. It's insight stuff, isn't it?
Mhm.
And then of course stage 3 would be the good recovery stuff that we like, engaging with life and in some new kind of way, changing relationships, relating to myself differently. It's the change stuff, that we want. And a lot of people might say, I don't know if you should be trying to do all of that, especially in a group setting. And I understand that perspective, but I think we've been able, if as long as we get the right people in, and we build enough around safety and stability, I think people can do it. Um, you know, uh, but I think to your point, a lot of the work that you're kind of getting, that you were sort of describing there for a minute, Anna, is that processing stuff, making sense out of that difference between how I understood it as a child, how I understand it now. How do I integrate that stuff together? You know?
Mhm. I want to also talk about what you are conceptualizing in terms of coping and when it is unhelpful with the idea around individuals who were not soothed as a child, who didn't
Right,
have healthy adults around, to model healthy coping,
right,
emotional pain that's so terrible that you use anything you can to manage it and
right.
just not reaching out, let's say, to others because of
Yeah.
your trauma of past betrayal. So let's talk a little bit about coping and how you address that in your program.
Yeah, so we have a whole chapter on coping. And I think a lot of the people that we work with as adults feel terrible about how they've coped in their 20s, 30s, 40s, whenever we've worked with them. They're much more vulnerable to drug and alcohol abuse, getting into very damaging, difficult relationship circumstances, et cetera, et cetera. And so, we really encourage people to kind of try to understand that not from a perspective of self-blame, but understand how they've coped psychologically. Why is it that they were vulnerable to falling into these ways of coping? And I think that's a really good, starting point uh, for people. Um,
It
and
hooks
to
right into schema therapy.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So we know the schema therapy says, look, you have an unresolved trauma history, you're going to get triggered schemas or, traumatic core beliefs are going to just fly up in your face and you're going to fall into avoidance. There's your drugs and your alcohol and your self-harming, or you're going to submit to these schemas. You're going to compensate in some way and get into trouble in relationships and so forth. And this is all very, very normal. Normal as in it's common for people with unresolved trauma histories. And so a lot of the perspective in the historical trauma program is to kind of normalize why and how people fall into destructive ways of coping, to try to see it psychologically rather than through a lens of self-blame. And that can open up some doors to getting hold of what healthier coping,
Yeah,
can look like.
you've done a good job of outlining coping styles, and obviously you're influenced by schema therapy, with your with your explanations of avoidant, isolating, subjugation, rigid, controlling, adaptive and healthy, maladaptive coping styles, and how they come out of the traumas that we've been exposed to. The reality of when an individual experiences betrayal, well, you're going to learn strategies to navigate that constant betrayal so that you can keep safe. And they may not serve you the best as you
Yeah, yeah,
age,
yeah. Yeah,
but they certainly are what an individual might have needed even just to survive. So
yeah,
recognizing survival in the ways in which we are shaped.
yeah,
So
absolutely. Absolutely. People developed and adopted unhealthy ways of coping because it made sense back then. And it probably did help them to some extent, to remain safe. And it just became a pattern.
mhm.
So, yeah.
Yeah, and I just think that a lot of these things around our themes and our beliefs about who we are and what helps us is probably comes through in much of the work that we do. Let's talk about signs of growth for a minute because that's all we've got left.
Yeah, yeah.
And you have some ideas about what signs of growth are important in the work that you're doing.
Oh, well, signs of growth. I mean, my short answer to that would be let's think about Maslow and let's think about human needs, right? So, what does growth mean? It's often when people work through their trauma well enough that they're now starting to get these important core needs met better, right? We get very excited about reducing symptoms and so forth, but actually, isn't it about people feeling safe, about people developing a stronger, better, healthier sense of self, about developing intimacy and closeness in relationships, and about experiencing a greater sense of meaning in their life. So I think it's very important, of course, to think about post-traumatic stress, but post-traumatic growth is,
Well,
very important.
I want to capture one thing that you wrote about that I thought was brilliant, and then we are going to sign off. That you identified new efforts, even if they're not initially successful, as crucial signs of growth: autonomy to make an independent decision on personally beneficial life steps, like just do it, like, you're driven, do it. Pivoting in a new direction if an experiment or decision does not work out. I want to thank you so much, Bill Wahl, for joining us today. And I want to remind people the historical trauma program and all the links are available. And of course, this will be out to podcast, which will be sent shortly. And be well, everybody. We're signing off, and I'll look forward to speaking with you all next month. Thank you, Bill, for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Anna.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Bear Psychology Radio Show with your host, Dr. Anna Baranowski, right here on Reality Radio 101.